Okay, in this video, I'm gonna make you guys an expert on Loki, the god of stories from Marvel Comics. And just for good measure, we're gonna talk about the most recent episode of Loki and how it all fits together. So, spoilers for Loki's most recent episode. So the question is, what's the deal with Loki, the god of stories? And where in the world did this guy come from? All right, this guy's ridiculously overpowered. And by the end of this video, you'll understand he's probably the most powerful being to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics, and is probably right up there next to the one above all. But all of this goes back to a story called Siege on Asgard, or just Siege as it's sometimes known. What had happened here is that Loki, as you know him, the trickster, the god of lies, the dude with the horns on his head, he existed in this way in Marvel Comics for decades, but he came to the realization that he was trapped in this role of always being the god of lies and never being able to win. And so in response to this, he did two things. The first is that in the one-shot comic Loki Siege #1, he basically manipulated Hela, the goddess of hell. Most of you guys know her from the MCU. He manipulated her to have his name removed from the Book of Hell. Because he's not an honorable warrior, when he died, he wouldn't go to Valhalla, he would go to the realm of hell. And so by doing this, it meant that when he died, he would be reborn. The second thing he did is he allowed himself to die in an honorable fashion by literally sacrificing his life during the events of Siege on Asgard. Now, following this, going into Thor issue number 617, Loki's reborn as a kid out there in like Paris or something like that. He's a human. He doesn't know anything about himself. And so Thor grabs him, he brings him back to Asgard and restores some of his memories. And so what this did is it broke him free from the chains of fate of being the god of lies and tricks, because now his story could basically start over, right? He hadn't been the god of lies for eons and eons. He could be whatever he wanted to be. Now, in the Journey into Mystery story, which was relaunched to tell the adventures of like Kid Loki, what ended up happening is that in issue 622, where Kid Loki had met this quote unquote echo of his former self, which seemed to be just kind of like a memory or something like that that existed out there, that this echo, right, the original Loki told Kid Loki, my whole plan was for my physical form to die, my mind in essence would remain alive, and then my physical body would be reborn as you, so that at a future point in time, I could take over your body. Kid Loki rejects this, right? He doesn't want to have anything to do with this. So quite literally, as crazy as it's going to sound, Kid Loki takes the mind and essence of his former self and confines it to a crow. And then he changes its name to Eichel, Loki spelled backwards, because the old Loki represents the inverse, right? The evil version of Loki, whereas Kid Loki is like a good guy. He's trying to be a hero. Now, all this comes to a head in Journey into Mystery issue number 645. And the reason why is because with Kid Loki rejecting the idea of the original Loki to sacrifice himself and allow the original Loki to inhabit his body, the original Loki, as a crow, went and did his own scheme. What you end up finding out is that Kid Loki had, at some point along the line, after the events of Fear itself, which we don't need to get into here, he had taken all the fear and all the doubt that he had about himself and confined it into something called the Fear Crown, and then kept it hidden for safekeeping. That the original Loki, once he learned about this, went to the demon Mephisto, and Mephisto was told, if you gain this Fear Crown, you can in turn unleash hell on Earth, which is exactly what Mephisto tried to do. He tried to become the new Satan. But Kid Loki came to the realization that the only way to destroy the Fear Crown was to destroy himself. And so in issue number 645, he agreed to the deal with the original Loki. He basically allowed the original Loki to take over his entire mind and body. Kid Loki, by all standards of measurement, ceased to exist, and the original Loki was now fully reborn on Earth in the form of a child, albeit going by the name Eichel. The kicker about all this is the original Loki did not expect to feel guilt and shame for his actions in basically killing this younger version of himself. but he did. And so following that, going over the course of Kid Loki's appearances in Marvel Comics, that's why you see him joining things like Young Avengers and so on and so forth. It's the original Loki trying to make amends, not just for destroying his younger self, but all of his past misdeeds. Now, this goes into Loki Volume 3, Issues 2 through 5. This is where the God of Stories landscape begins to pick up. And what you have is Loki, who's brought by two cosmic entities named Then and Now to a place called the House of Ideas. It turns out to be a false House of Ideas, and we'll explain why that matters here in a second, but the power he's given here is to basically add to what's called the Book of Loki, basically chronicling his own adventures. That after he had become Kid Loki and then grown into a teenager and all that kind of stuff, he basically became the king of Jotunheim and was just bored out of his mind. But that was destined to be his existence. By making a deal with Then and Now, what it does is it allows him to add pages. In effect, any untold story now becomes real. So if, for example, he decides to write into the books of Loki, once upon a time in the distant past, I turned Thor into a cockroach, Thor would suddenly have this memory that at some point in his distant past, he was a cockroach, right? That's how that power worked. It's already kind of OP. It becomes even more overpowered because in the Immortal Thor run, which is recently just launched, what you end up learning is that Loki realizes that the House of Ideas of Then and Now is not real, that it was a false House of Ideas. He actually visits the real House of Ideas, and what he's given is the real God of Stories power. What this means is that Loki now has the power to rewrite any existing event within the confines of Marvel Comics on either a universal or seemingly a multiversal scale, or even rewrite past events to where they now become real. So if some event was transpiring right now in Marvel Comics, Loki can just change it on a whim. Like that. He is as close as anybody gets to being the one above all. And in fact, I would argue he's equal in power to the one above all. But there are caveats here. If Loki changes something in Marvel Comics in the here and now, it will have an effect on the future. What that effect is, he doesn't know. Because it's one thing to be the God of Stories, it's another to be all-knowing and to know exactly how every eventuality of every possible change in every timeline will ultimately play out. But with that power alone, he can write people into existence, he can write people out of existence, he can change the origins of any characters that exist out there. This guy is, by all standards of measurement, a writer of Marvel Comics living inside the Marvel Comics universe, right? It's crazy how powerful he is. Now let's take all that information and let's apply this to what's going on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe right now. So as we know, with the most recent episode of Loki in season 2, Loki has now gained control of his ability to time slip. In effect, he can travel back and forth in time at a whim. He can go anywhere he wants to along the timeline. And I would go so far as to argue that because he gained this power in a place that is not bound by space or time in the TVA, he can actually jump between realities. He can go from one universe to the next and any point in time, which makes him a ridiculously powerful character. Now, in my mind, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe is far more toned down in terms of the grandiosity of the kind of things that you see in Marvel Comics, the idea of him making the statement, I can change the story, has less to do with him sitting down with a piece of paper and just rewriting the entirety of history, and is more to do with him just going to the past and changing something. So what is it that he's going to do? My thought here is this. I think that what Loki's going to do is he's going to come to this realization, if he hasn't already, that the death of He Who Remains and the idea that the multiverse returns and all those universes are being compacted into a loom that just wasn't built to handle all those eventualities at one point in time, that the destruction of the loom, the end of all time in existence, is the eventuality of He Who Remains' death. There's no way to stop that from happening. Anytime he dies, this is exactly what happens. And so because of that, he is going to go back and he could potentially try to stop Sylvie from killing He Who Remains. But the problem with this is that if He Who Remains continues to live, that means the sacred timeline stays intact. The only timelines that are allowed to exist are the timelines that result in the creation of He Who Remains. Any timeline that results in any variant of Kang other than He Who Remains is pruned. But that flies in the face of what we saw at the end of Ant-Man and Wasp: Quantumania. All those variants of Kang popping back up. So what that means to me is the multiverse has to return. I think He Who Remains is going to stay dead. Loki's going to go back to the moment when the loom was about to explode, or some point after the death of He Who Remains, and he's going to say, we just have to shut the loom down. Let the multiverse run free. Let all the different universes come into existence. Now, is that trading one threat for another? Yes, but the guaranteed eventual destruction and the unraveling of all of time in existence is a far more severe threat than just a bunch of crazy guys teaming up and running around the multiverse trying to conquer it, right? And so with the multiverse running free, this now allows all those variants of Kang to start popping up. What I think is going to happen, and I said this 2 years ago, long before this information is coming out now, so I just want to say, I'm not even saying this because of the information that's out now. No, man, I called this 2 years ago, that Loki, in realizing the threat of the variant Kangs that exist out there, is going to form the multiversal Avengers. He's going to either call them the Exiles, or they'll just be the multiversal Avengers, whatever you want to call them, right? Whatever name is given to them. But it's going to quite literally be kind of like Robert DaCosta's multiversal Avengers from Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, The Collapse of All Things, except this time they're not going to be killed. They're not going to be like eradicated in one fell swoop. They'll survive for longer than a comic book. But still, right? Loki's going to form the multiversal Avengers. That Avengers team is going to go to war against the Kangs, and it will quite literally, like the whole Secret Wars, will be called that because it'll be a war that exists in secret because the general public doesn't know about it. A multiversal war of all the superheroes that Loki can find, every variant of Captain America that hasn't been killed by some variant of Kang across the multiverse, every variant of Iron Man, every variant of Spider-Man, all those guys, right? I mean, just kind of imagine that, man. Like, imagine Miles Morales from Into the Spider-Verse, right? Teaming up with Tom Holland and Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, who a lot of you guys like now, but only because of the newest Spider-Man movie. You never liked him before, so you don't get to ride on this ride. Imagine that. The whole Spider-Verse teaming up with like the whole Iron Man verse, right? Robert Downey Jr. comes back along with however many versions exist, right? Like that combined with like every variant of Captain America. So like Chris Evans comes back, all the different variants of the Fantastic Four. Like imagine that, dude. Imagine that. All those guys facing off against all these Kangs. That's what I think is going to happen in Secret Wars. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.